Hello.
Oh,
Hey, welcome to the Cult Bar, everybody. Renee, how are you doing?
I'm sick, but excited to be
Uh,
here anyway.
yeah, 'tis the season, though, right? Unfortunately.
What the wild thing is that I don't know if I have like a cold or it's just allergies from all the crazy wind in California, but it is affecting me exactly the same, so it kind of doesn't matter.
That's great. That's great. So you don't know which is which. So, yeah, all right, great. So, anyway, why don't we start with what we're drinking? I know you're sick, so you're going a different route than me. So, what are you having for a beverage this evening?
I've got a hot toddy in my ringleader of the shit show coffee mug.
That is very apropos mug. So,
Ooh, I went a little heavy on the lemon, but it's good.
well, hey, the lemon will help. So if you're not,
Yeah.
if you're not allergic or whatever. So what I went with was something called a chain smoker, which is like the most generic looking drink when you pour it. So
It sounded
it
good
is,
though.
yeah, it's 2 ounces of mezcal, 3/4 ounce of dry vermouth, and then a 1/4 ounce of an amaro. So they had a very specific one listed in the recipe. I just have regular amaro, so whatever, amaro
Right.
Montenegro, and then some orange bitters. So we'll see how that is. You've had hot toddies on here. I think we've all had hot toddies. We're all adults. So, okay, that's interesting.
Oh, like interesting bad or
Um, I think the Amaro is just doing something a little because you have the smoky mezcal and
right.
then dry vermouth, which is a whole different tasting element, and then the Amaro is almost a little bit more on the drier side. So it's definitely more of a drier, almost drinks like a dry martini.
Oh.
Like it doesn't taste like a dry martini, but that finish you get from a dry martini. It's
Yeah.
that sort of finish. So it's
I
good.
love
It's just
mezcal, but it does sound interesting, as you
yeah,
said.
and I'm not getting any of the orange bitters in it either, which is interesting because I figured that the bitters would, but it's bitters, so maybe that's why. But anyway, pretty decent. I'd actually drink this again. Most of the ones I have in here, I would never drink again.
I ran into like so many while I was looking for when I was going to drink a regular drink that had blue curacao, and I feel like I've only ever had anything with blue curacao in it on this show.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it's like I forget what the one we had, and I was like, "All right, I'm gonna have this," and I forget what it was. It was Fernet, and I was like, I'm probably never having, and I have a whole bottle of it now because you can't buy it in little bottles. So
I got a
anyway,
lot of weird shit in the bar. We look like we drink all the time in my house because of our bar setup. And that's
yeah,
not even because of this show. It's just because like we will make whatever random specific cocktail that we find, and then you have like, oh yeah, of course I have Benedictine. Who doesn't have Benedictine?
I don't. The problem is like my liquor shelf is almost all whiskey, so it's like I don't have a great variety of stuff. So, but anyway, so now that we have drinks out of the way, shall we? Hold on. It's been a while since we've done this, so
Yeah.
shall we get to some news? All right, let me pull that up. And this is what we're going to have here.
Yeah. So this is a big bummer to me, actually. Through the documentary series Scientology and the Aftermath, I actually came to have a great affection for Mike Render. He's one of the very, very few people that I've encountered in all of my like reading about cults, watching documentaries, doing the show, that really seemed like he was trying to do as much good as he did bad once he left Scientology. If you don't know who he is, he was pretty high up in Scientology, and he was basically in charge of the arm that fucks people up when they leave. And eventually, it got to a point where he couldn't tolerate it anymore, and he left. And he became one of their most outspoken critics, and really just took a lot of abuse from them, but kept going. Started a new family. Unfortunately, never got to connect with the children that disconnected from him because he was a suppressive person. And he passed away from esophageal cancer, which is a pretty rough way to go. So, yeah, it's a bummer. It's not fun news, but when is cult news that fun?
Mostly never.
Mostly never. So at least there was a bright side to this before. Like everybody dies eventually. He just maybe went a little earlier than you'd like. But yeah, I think Mike Rinder was a really good example of the way that you could actually make amends, not just
say it.
Yeah.
Which we will get to tonight, because there's a few people in that I want to get to. So nice stage to die at, though, there, sir. Good, well played.
Yeah, unfortunately, he leaves behind, like, I think, a 12-year-old son or something like that. So that is a bummer. But
yeah. So rest in peace, and way to fight after you get out of the mess. So good on Mr. Rinder. So. All right. So tonight, as our little bar insinuates, we are talking about the Synanon Fix, which I will admit I had never heard of Synanon. Never.
I cheated.
I had not. I was just like, okay, well, we're going to jump into this. It's a docu-series called the Synanon Fix on HBO Max. I will not call it Max. Fuck that. It's HBO Max. It's like people calling like Twitter. I'm calling it Twitter till the end of time. So fuck that noise. But yeah. Also, Daniel jumped in at just the right time.
I know,
right? So yeah. At any rate, what we're going to talk about tonight is the Synanon Fix. So you and I are going to do usually we kind of break down episodes and do all that, but I think what we're going to do tonight is we're going to take a little different approach. We're going to do kind of just a general overview of Synanon as an entity, and where it started and how it ended, because it did end. Some of them don't end when we watch the docuseries. In this case, it did.
It was a bummer.
Yeah. So, but in this case, this was a group that came together under a guy named Chuck Dieterich, who basically was an addict. He was an alcoholic, and he thought he went to AA and it did help, but he thought he could do something better. So he created Synanon. So they would take in alcoholics, but eventually started taking in drug addicts, heroin. And this is in 1958 when heroin is really starting to really be prominent, and nobody in society knew what to do with drug addicts, especially something that heavy like heroin, that powerful. So he would take them in, and his methods were definitely unorthodox. Basically, he would make them sit on a couch, and someone would sit with them the whole time until they, quote unquote, sobered up. That's how I viewed it. Yeah,
but it's actually a lot more. I mean, it's kind of weird, but we use it like a lot of the stuff that they did. We use now, and we'll get to that because it's kind of interesting. But sorry, I'm going to be sniffling through the whole show. Trigger warning if you can't handle when people sniffle. I'm sorry.
So he's doing this in, I believe in, what was it, Santa Monica? Is that where they started? I believe. Yeah, I just wrote California down, so that's a little too generic, but I'm pretty sure it was Santa Monica.
Santa Monica, yeah. They were on the beach.
Yeah, so he had this place in Santa Monica right on the beach, which upset a lot of the local folks who didn't like people being there, because our society is not great about treating addicts well.
We had addicts, and we were mixing races on the beach, which is the nicest place in town. So yeah.
So a lot of Casa del Mar was Joker mentioned that. So yep, correct. Or was that the second one? Maybe
that was later, but
the first one was an armory. So anyway. So he brings in everybody, and they do all this stuff, try to help them get, and basically it's no doctors, no people with any sort of medical expertise. They're just a community of people, sort of, they're Patch Adamsing it to try to make it work. And there's a lot of people who come in here who were there from the beginning, and they talk to a lot of folks like that, like Lena and Miriam and some other folks, JD, who was Chuck Dietrich's daughter. And Bill Goodson was a kid who was in it. So there's a lot of different folks that talk about the beginning and how they were all just completely messed up on heroin and they didn't have anywhere to turn. Um, so they turned to Synanon, and Synanon welcomed everybody. Do you want to talk a bit about that, like just the openness of Synanon, especially at the early stages?
Yeah, well, so in the early stages, it really was just, well, they call them dope fiends, which is like that's not what we call people anymore. But so they were doing that, and then as they grew in popularity, there were just people who really liked what they were doing, and they started encouraging people who were known as lifestylers to join, and they had to be abstinent from all drugs, alcohol, whatever, as well, aside from cigarettes, which we'll get to. Um, but yeah, so it definitely became like when they started out, when they started growing, it was all people dealing with addiction coming into kick. And that's when they got to spread across the country because they were the only people who could get anybody off heroin at the time. Nobody really knew what they were doing. And the idea was like, have an addict sit with an addict and they'll help each other through, which is actually like the cornerstone of residential treatment
Hmm.
now. That is really what we do. And it's funny you mentioned not having any medical people because one thing I learned that I didn't know, this is a myth I believed that kicking heroin could kill you, and it's actually the withdrawal from heroin is not as deadly as the withdrawal from alcohol. It's very rare for someone to die from withdrawal from alcohol from heroin, but it's actually pretty common for people to die from alcohol withdrawal.
Yeah, I will say, as someone who has been in an environment where I saw lots of people coming into where I was staying, which was a prison, and I saw lots of people who were heroin addicts come in, and them coming off of heroin was hard. Like just the physical toll that rips through your body as your body's trying to heal itself from it is pretty awful. And there were people who came in who were alcoholics, but like the heroin folks, that was this was in the '90s, so it was it was hard. I saw a lot of people deal with that. I didn't see as many people come in because I think our society has a little bit more tolerance for alcoholics to find treatment and
Oh,
do
yes.
things, and people who
Well,
are on harder drugs do not.
we could do a whole hour, 2 hours, 3 hours on what's weird about how we treat alcohol addiction. But the thing is that like when an alcoholic is in a place where they cannot quit without severe medical issue, um, they can always cut back. And heroin doesn't really work that way.
Yeah.
So I say they always, because that's not true. And we'll get into that because that plays a role in this as well, is how insidious alcohol addiction is. But like I know people who've been told by their doctors not to stop drinking because there's just no room for alcoholics in a lot of treatment centers and it's too dangerous to quit once you reach a certain stage, etc. It's all really a lot more complicated than we might like to think. And when you look at like the 1950s, when all of these things were looked at as moral failings, they were not looked at as mental health issues. They were not looked at as medical issues. If you were a dope fiend, that was your fault. If you were an alcoholic, that was your fault. And, AA was still relatively new. Um, One thing that's interesting is that Chuck Dietrich also used LSD in his alcohol recovery, which Bill A., the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, actually used LSD to get sober. He did not use the 12 steps.
Yeah.
Um, so I thought that was interesting because the attitudes about LSD were a lot different back then too. So it's just like I feel like it's hard to imagine what it was like in this time and place because it is so different now.
Yeah.
Not anybody treats heroin addicts any better. I don't think that's true. But there's options at least. And I don't think really just weren't options other than Synanon. It's
Yeah.
not that they were the only ones who could do it. They were the only ones who were trying.
Yeah. So, but to the point of the guy who created Synonym, which was, Chuck Dietrich. It's
Dietrich.
spelled different. It's spelled different. It's Dederich. So it's not
Dietrich.
Dietrich. It's like Dietrich. I don't know. So he talked a lot about how he was a very heavy drinker and lost two wives and multiple kids because they didn't want to deal with him because he was a pretty bad alcoholic. But he also was a prodigious smoker. And about how he smoked 3 packs of cigarettes a day, which that's a
Cigarettes.
that's a lot of cigarettes.
Yeah.
That's 60 cigarettes a day. That's a lot. Um, which part of Synanon, and I don't know if you want to jump into this now, but we talked before the show about how just like one of the notes I made was like there is an amazing amount of smoking going on in this. Now, granted, this is being filmed in the 50s and 60s,
Right.
and so
1958. Your doctor would smoke in the exam room with you, so we got to keep that in mind.
yeah, so it is. Yeah, yes, it was literally a smokestack, Daniel. You're not wrong. I mean,
Maybe
everybody
that's
was
the
just
real
smoking.
reason the neighbors were upset was the cloud of cigarette smoke coming from the middle of the
Yeah,
beach.
yeah, but anyway, but one of the things that they provided was that the Synanon would provide free cigarettes, which like I said, I had associated recovery, and a lot of times you see it always. Anytime you see it depicted on TV, or you watch a documentary, or it's like just the amount of smoking going on when people are trying to detox from whatever they're trying to detox from is tremendous.
Yeah.
So I have never smoked a cigarette in my life, and that's because my mom smoked and I fucking hated it. But
Never smoked 3 packs a day.
definitely never smoked 3 packs a day. My mom was never that prodigious either. She was definitely like half a pack. She wasn't like a heavy smoker. But I know you're also studying like recovery and all this
I have
stuff.
my little. Can you see? Is it mirrored or is it right?
Yeah,
That's mine. Not
400. Look how much money you saved doing that. That's
yeah.
nuts.
The law and not like just over a year too. But I mean,
Yeah,
seriously,
congrats.
California. But yeah, that's my most recent attempt. But I think this one's gonna stick. So
Yeah, my mom made many attempts too, and then finally it stuck because every year at Christmas I would ask her to stop smoking. It was such a pressure. I was such a pressuring little prick when I was a kid, but I was like, yeah. But anyway, that was something that. So, do you want to speak to the idea of cigarette smoking? Like I had mentioned that I felt like it was a bit like trading one addiction for another,
well,
but
there's a
like,
lot of debate about it in the field of addiction treatment. Like Doug said, I'm not an expert by any means. I'm a student. I'm literally in the middle of qualifying to do substance abuse counseling. So like, everything I say with a grain of salt, but there's a lot of debate about it in addiction treatment because some places are going to becoming non-smoking campuses, the residential treatment.
mhm,
Just because everything is kind of going that way, right? But the idea of like coffee and cigarettes at your AA and NA meetings is like really common. And I was just sharing, like somebody shared their sobriety anniversary, which is a really big one, and they had like a coffee and a cigarette like worked into the image that they shared to celebrate it. So it's all kind of intertwined. But one of the things that gets into here though is like once you start saying like expanding what abstinence means, it starts to get kind of difficult because does that mean, well, you can't smoke, but you can have coffee, or you can't smoke or have coffee, but sugar is okay, or
mhm,
and you could go on and on and on because we also know that people with addictive personalities will get addicted to activities and it will react in the brain and in the reward system the same way as a drug, usually not as intensely as a drug, but enough to have someone act compulsively and fuck up their lives, right? So it's kind of an interesting one. I happen to be a believer in non abstinence only drug treatment, addiction treatment for the people it works for. It doesn't work for
mhm.
everybody. Some people literally, they just can't do anything or they're going to go right back in. And it's
Yeah,
like a very personal thing. But the idea in the 1950s and 60s of people smoking, it's not a big deal. And you got to think too, what we've found in a lot of studies is that when you give people with very serious addictions like heroin, fentanyl, other opiates, um, like rewards, tangible rewards for staying in treatment, that they do better. And
yes.
so free cigarettes actually might have been a massive key to their success.
Might have been. I mean, and especially for the time frame, right? So,
Yeah.
like you said, 50s and 60s was like prime smoking time. Like everybody just smoked. So, I feel like we had going from like from the early 1900s through the 60s. Like cigarettes were like the thing. Like
Oh, I mean, like
everybody smoked them.
California was one of the first states to go non-smoking in restaurants, and it was in the 90s.
It was the 90s.
Yeah.
Um,
But
so
yeah, no,
yeah,
'cause I remember going into restaurants and being in the smoking section because my mom smoked. And then, if when I would go to lunch or dinner with my grandma, we'd be in the non-smoking section and there's just like smoke wafting over.
yeah,
Um,
it wasn't very
everyone
much
had
separation.
ashtrays. Yeah, like it was kind of a wild time, but that was the 80s. And
Yeah.
I think when I stopped smoking this time, I would say it was like this last stint was the first time I really felt like I was being judged for smoking in public. Or it just became like you cannot smoke in public. People will be like, "What are you doing?" Which legit, it's gross.
Yeah, and one of my kids is actually allergic to cigarette smoke, so that's kind of an incentive to keep him away. But let's now we had a little diversion, but I always wanted to talk about that, but we never really delved into it before. So one of the there's several foundational rules for Synanon when you come in. There is no drugs, no violence,
And
um,
there's threats of violence.
no threats of violence, which matters because the big part of the Synanon thing that they came in, which was a bit revolutionary at the time, was they would do something called the game, the Synanon game, where basically people could say whatever the fuck they wanted in a group like chat, like everybody's sitting in a room, like a group therapy session, and they're just saying the worst shit to each other.
What and it comes down to how we define violence, right? Because those meetings sound violent. They
They
are
sound
yelling,
verbally violent.
screaming, and standing up and leaning over you, and it's very intense. And again, we spent a lot of time in the classes I'm in, uh, you know, being trained how to avoid groups from going that way. So that was kind of an interesting one. It's weird because well, you know what I'll say? Okay, so it helped these people because they had like a faucet for their emotional issues, but like it never actually taught them how to deal with those issues.
No.
And I really
there was
think
there
that
was there was no like, hey, look inside. No, like
yeah, and it was just like I don't know. I feel like I said this to you. I said this to my husband while I was watching it. It's like you hear about dry drunks, right? People who quit drinking, but they still behave the exact same way they behaved when they were alcoholics because they're not working on any of their shit. It really feels like that was what Chuck was, that he went from being an alcoholic to he developed this because the game was developed before Synanon. That was his next step after AA. And that was like a control thing for him. And then, of course, we see it gets his control over the group gets wilder and wilder and more intense until he relapses and gets into some severely late stage alcoholism. So yeah, I don't know. Maybe I want to say like I don't want to say that a system doesn't work if the person who came up with it relapses because people relapse.
mhm. Yeah, I agree.
But
You can't say that. You
the way
can't say that doesn't
he
work. But yeah,
yeah, when you look at the way he behaved, it's almost like he didn't relapse. It's just that he found other ways to feed his addict until he could go back to drinking without that like fucking his world up.
yeah. And I remember there was one person who said that the game was basically like a verbal street fight, and they have, of course, all these people. As I mentioned you, and I said in chat, I was like, why do these fuckers record everything? They recorded everything. Like you're recording these people just being horrible to each other. And the one lady, Lena, I think her name was, said something like, "Well, it made us look inward and look into ourselves." And I'm like, that feels terrible. Like I don't want to look and like have someone say, "You are just the worst human being ever because you did this." And then I'm like, well, that makes me feel terrible. Why do I want to investigate that more? Like I am not sure. Yeah, yeah, but it's not in good jest. You're right, Daniel.
Well,
It is not in good jest.
I would also say like more intense than a roast because in a roast, if you were yelling and screaming and carrying on, like you would be asked to exit stage left. You would not be allowed to just keep going. And that was it. It sound, if you heard it from the outside, you never believed that people weren't being physical.
Yeah. But I mean, they are getting people sober. So something was working there. But like to me, if I had been an addict and walked into that, that would have just destroy me. Like I wouldn't be able to handle that. I know I wouldn't.
Yeah.
So
We know too, like looking inward and figuring your shit out is a big important piece of the puzzle, right?
Mhm.
In stopping any behavior that you don't enjoy or that isn't serving
Or
you.
is detrimental. Yeah.
Yeah, but we also know that people tend to do a lot better if they're allowed to do that in an environment that feels safe as opposed to one that feels confrontational and scary. Um, and it's no surprise, right? As this thing goes on, the game gets more and more intense and it becomes a tool of manipulation. And like, Chuck takes it over in a way that's really kind of scary and weird, which we talked about this too, right? Like this is like the greatest hits of all of the different cults that we've covered.
Yeah. You called it a stew, which was about the most appropriate way to describe it. It's like take all the hits from all the cults we've covered, and this is like a stew of all of them.
Not like a good stew though.
No, no, like
Like a lot.
the kind of stew that like you're like I'm going to throw all this in and see if it tastes good, and then you're like absolutely not. It does not taste
Yeah.
good.
So what was it? The one, God, where the kids were getting beaten and he was calling up on the phone and telling them what to do. What was that
Yeah,
called? Oh, stupid Apple shit.
yeah. I well, they were doing the game too with kids, which so basically with uh, okay. Sorry, this one actually popped up. Joker mentioned Darren Straight Ink with Synanon is the basic foundation of troubled teen industry. That's a very good point.
Yeah.
Because what Synanon did with their kids is they eventually did this thing where they use some sort of model that I guess is something that's common with. They mentioned Israel. I don't know if it's like Hasidic Jews or they didn't. They were not very specific about what
I think
kind of.
I
And
think they're talking about the compulsory service in Israel, which does not happen with little kids. It happened, yeah, anyway. But the point
but
is, it
yeah,
was
but they
very
said
they started out with just like a boarding school, but then the punk squad thing became like this is for the troubled kids. And they were like, well, the troubled kids got this military school treatment and they did so much better. So let's do it with everyone, which
yeah. So basically, they would do this sort of very, like you said, a boarding school approach to these kids, but they also did stuff with the kids that were troublesome. Um, they would make it where uh, these kids would turn into punk squad, like which is just a dump, like a hey, you're a little punk, that kind of thing. Like so, but and they would abuse the shit out of these kids in the punk squad. They would just do everything they could to break them down. It was bad. Some of the people in that were the people that were running that was like the Buddy Jones guy and that Ron. I'm gonna say his last name was Mullen, and they did bad shit to those kids. And one of the things we see recurring is like you see all these abusive, awful things being done to these people in the game and just through Synanon in general, and these kids who went through all this shit. And some of the people were just like, "Yeah, it was great. Like it made me really focus." And I'm just like,
yeah. Well,
like more than any cult I think we've covered. This one is where we've seen the most of the people that were in the series were just still completely in, even though the thing was over. It was
I
like
think
super
also
weird.
there's a there's a bent, right? Because so the podcast, which is called The Sunshine Place about Synanon, it's told from the narrator is the daughter of a former Synanon member. She wasn't raised in it or anything. Her parents were in and out before she was born. But I feel like it's a little more balanced. Like there's a little bit more of an appreciation for the fact that, like, no, it did not turn out all okay. Um, which is not to say that this documentary makes it seem like everything was okay, but the majority of the people they talked to were like, "Oh, it was a great place to grow up. Oh, it's great. Oh, I miss it. Like, I wish, we could have done it forever or whatever." And it's just like every time a new escalation occurred, people left. They had kids sneaking out and, being aided by the neighbors to escape. Like this was not the experience of everyone.
Yeah, what's funny is they didn't touch on those as much until a little bit later, but and they didn't really, even when they did that, they didn't really go full bore into just how bad it was for the kids. And this is the thing, watching the video of the kids doing the game was
Very,
horrible.
yeah,
That was the most upsetting bit of this whole thing to me, was just watching these kids. Like the one kid, Bill Godson, who was his mom went in because she was just really addicted to heroin and knew she couldn't like do anything and wanted to do something better for her kids. And he said there were kids that just they couldn't do it. They just he's like, I knew how to just kind of be a chameleon and do whatever. And there were kids that just that wasn't the place for them. They couldn't they couldn't defend themselves. And that's the thing. You have to defend yourself in those things. It was awful. That was the most harrowing part of the entire documentary for me, was
what I
watching
think
the kids do that.
I get in these things, right? When we look at these things that happened in the past where like maybe they had the right idea and then they went the total wrong way, and I get really mad, right? Like I get really mad that Timothy Leary like ruined psychedelic research for mental health because he had to like go get high in Mexico instead. And I get really mad at this because what we know now is that another thing that they did right was allowing these women to bring their kids into treatment, because a lot of women actually wait till much, much later in their addiction to get treatment because they are the ones in charge of taking care of the kids.
Yeah.
And if they can get someone to watch their kids for 30 or 60 days, great. But what if they need 90? Who's going to watch their kids? Are they going to lose custody? Are they going to whatever, right? So like allowing kids to be in those facilities is actually a net positive, but allowing kids to be in Synanon absolutely is not, right? And so it's like this thing of like they brought the kids in because women wanted to leave, but then when they didn't know what to do with the kids, they sent them away.
Yeah, and there was part of it where like that Bill Godson guy was saying, like, you just saw the addicts come in. Like the kids saw all these people coming in who were just completely messed up, and they got to see all that. Now, is that good or bad? I mean, to me, it seems like it would be bad, especially if they're really little. But at the same time, there's also seeing like this is how people are messed up, and here's how they can redeem themselves and get better. It's like,
Yes, but they put the kids to work also. The kids had to get like, get the wet rags and help and assist. And that's too much to put on a kid because they don't understand what's going on. They don't have the mental or emotional capacity to understand what's going on, right? Like there's actually no such thing as like a 6-year-old that's mature for their age because your brain just isn't developed enough, right?
no, it's not.
So there's a lot of stuff about it that was really upsetting to me. But I think like the other thing, and the documentary really glossed over this, and I really want to hit on it hard, is that because we had a lot of people who seemed to have a positive reflection on their time in Synanon, what we heard was we saw people get clean, and then when they left, they came back again as addicts just as bad as they were before. So we didn't want to leave. But in the Sunshine Place, what we understand is a little bit different, which is they are told not to leave. They are told if you leave, you will die. But they do mention that, but
They do, yeah.
it's hammered in, it's hammered in, it's hammered in. If you leave, you will die. And again, I just took my law and ethics class. We're literally not allowed to tell people that they'll die. You're not allowed to do that. That's very manipulative, right? And the thing is that two things. Relapse is like an unavoidable reality of addiction. It takes people several tries, especially with something as serious as heroin. And two, you can't just make people stay in rehab forever, even if it works. But if it works, shouldn't it work? Shouldn't you be able to leave?
Yeah.
So yeah, they really, I mean, they did it from the beginning, create a system that relied on these people never leaving.
Yeah, and there's like I said, the when we were talking about the children thing, that one hit me hard, and I really struggled through that particular bit because like these kids were just kids, and they were being thrust into something that they were not prepared for and should not have been a part of. But there's quite a lot of other things that were disturbing too, even though they were having success. But again, this is the early days. Nobody knew what the fuck they were doing. Like
Yeah.
this is like they were trying to sort it out on the fly. So maybe you give them a little bit of leeway on that, not much, because but again, we're also in the early stages where people didn't understand just how, like, when you're being just verbally abusive to people, how bad that was. Because if you
Yeah.
look at families, like, you would see verbally abusive shit on TV where, like, the husband was just awful to his wife. And that was accepted. That was normal. That was, well, that's how it is. That's how marriage is. And, the dad beats his kids around is because they're misbehaving. And, like, there was a lot of that sort of
Well,
emphasis, even
and even when
in
it
that time.
was to a point where people did not approve of it, they didn't do anything about it, right? It was just a taboo thing about like how awful it must be in that house down the street, but it's none of our business.
Oh, yeah, a lot of that too. um, so a few other things that, like, so at this point, Cinnamon's growing. It's growing, like you said. It is now starting to expand. It's going across the country. It's all over the place. It's in New York, and I think they have one in Detroit. And they have several going through California, including one in was it
Tamales
Tamaras?
Bay, which is yeah, that was where a lot of the worst stuff happened was Tamales Bay.
Yeah, Tamales Bay. And so, but there's one person that, like, with the kids, we were talking a bit about the kids, and I just want to hit. There was one lady named Rebecca, and I cannot remember her last name. I didn't write it down, but her mom was also in Synanon. And Rebecca was just her story was, she was such a resilient person to go through all that and being like, I just want to get out and do my own thing. And she just never let that place, despite them trying to beat it out of her, get her down. And that's a
Was she
person
the
who,
one who JD was like, go have a life and tell me what it's like?
yes, she was
Yeah.
like, you need to get out now. Like, she told her later on. And she couldn't get into a college because Synanon, which had a school, it was not accredited. So you couldn't just whatever
Here's what's
grade
crazy
you
about
got.
that, though. That this is the thing that's actually crazy about that because they did test them and they did study these kids and they actually
Tested
outperformed public
great.
school kids by miles, right?
Yeah.
So whatever was going on in the treatment of these kids absolutely was shit, but the education was actually really good, but they weren't accredited. They didn't get diplomas. So
Yeah.
a lot of the
But
kids didn't go to school, but she contacted, I can't remember the guy's name, but somebody who had come out and written about Synanon was a professor somewhere, and he helped her get in without having to do like community college or anything else, which is
pretty
amazing.
amazing.
But none of the other kids got that opportunity, like
Yeah. That guy was he was a professor at Cal State Northridge. I can't remember what his name was either, but he helped her get
or
into college.
something. Anyway,
Yeah. But anyway, she got in there and ended up graduating from a school in New York State. Barnard, something to that
yeah,
effect. I wrote down. But anyway, the schooling system, when they were talking about how they would kind of just say, well, what do you want to learn? Let the kids learn what they want to learn, which is very kind of like a precursor to Montessori to me, like that whole
oh,
Montessori school.
that's very
Oh,
interesting.
yeah.
It sounded to me like what we know as like unschooling or child-led learning. Yes, Daniel
That one,
Barnard.
Daniel. Barnard. Sorry.
You showed
Sorry,
it like
Renee.
at the same time.
Yeah, sorry. But that's the one. That's the one that she graduated from. So, of
Yeah, but like
course,
unschooling and
Daniel would know that.
child-led learning can work with the right type of student and the right type of leaders, and it seems like it worked for them academically, if not in any other measurable way. But yeah, it was interesting. And I think that's where we get this thing. It was like a really fucking mixed bag, especially in the early years where like a lot of really positive things were happening. But at the same time, even in the beginning, a lot of really abusive things were happening.
Yeah, a lot of abuse, and but also in this early time where they were starting to gain some popularity. I know you want to discuss some of the, like, they mentioned that there were some celebrities that would come and be this part where you talked about the lifestyles. These are people who didn't have addiction issues, but they liked what Synanon was doing. Also, this was also in the middle where they're in the middle of doing like the civil rights era. So, Chuck Diederich, the leader, married a black woman, like, and he was a white guy. Like, that was not normal back at that time. It's like
Well,
you,
and that the centers had black and white residents living together, which was a massive issue for a lot of people.
Yeah. So it was integrated, and even though we were supposedly not racist at that time, we still were, and we still are. But but the idea that they had all these people just living together, and listen, the ideal of that, I can totally understand why, like, that would be so appealing. Like if I was of age at that time, that would be super appealing to me. Like I
Yeah.
could totally understand why that would be appealing. It's like, oh, okay, like everybody's just kind of they're people. We're all people living together, trying to support each other in any way we can. The appeal of that's really massive. I can see that.
And one of the things that the documentary doesn't really spend a lot of time on, which I think is important to understand how lifestylers got involved, is that these parties, they would throw parties to raise their profile, do outreach, PR, whatever.
Make money.
That's where a lot of these celebrities would come. That's where a lot of locals would come. And the Synanon people, served alcohol and encouraged a party atmosphere, even though they personally did not drink, they personally did not do drugs. And so the idea of what Synanon was when you're at the party versus when you're living in Synanon were two very different things. And I don't have any like insider knowledge on how much lifestylers knew before they joined or whatever, but it is that we hear about that, right? Like,
Sure.
what's his name? The guy who does the bite model. He was flirty fished, right? The girls made it seem like if he came to this weekend with the Moonies that he was going to get laid, and then he gets there and finds out that you don't ever get laid again if you're a Moonie. Like, so this is a cult tactic, and it was happening right at the beginning.
Yeah. And the idea that they had celebrities, like they mentioned a few of them, like one of the ones that threw me off was Leonard Nimoy, but like that was so out of the blue. So is this the guy you're talking about, Steve?
Yes, Steve Hassan. Thank you. I knew it was Steve something, and I just was like,
yeah. So before we get into some other things here, we should note that as Synanon is expanding, Diederik is. His name's Chuck. I wrote Diederik all the time. I should just wrote Chuck. It's much shorter in my notes. I have a shit ton of notes. So Chuck decides that, oh, well, I'm just going to start making businesses out of this. So they make something called AdGap, which does like all this business for other businesses, like a middleman. They make boatloads of money out of that. Like he gets donations from all these celebrities.
And to be clear, he's already a nonprofit at this point through the addiction treatment. He got his 501c3 status.
Yep.
Yeah.
So he's doing that. They're making lots of money. All the people and people that come into Synanon, like all the cults we cover, hey, you're making money, give us all the money and we will take care of you. And so their thing is like, oh, well, you come, you could stay here. We will make sure you're fed, you're clothed, you're housed, all that stuff, which sounds great when you're an addict.
Yeah.
It sounds great when you're an addict because none of those things are guaranteed when you're an addict. But once you get clean and now you're just like, I'm just working and I'm not making any money. Later on, we heard a guy who got an inheritance of like $25,000, which was a lot at the time. But one of the guys named Ron Cook, who is I think he's more of a villain in this than Chuck Diederik is. I really do. I think he's just a super shithead. He was an accountant for them who was not an addict. He just came in and was their accountant. And
from the early days too, yeah.
From the early days. And he was a believer. He still is. But he told that guy, when you're in Synanon, typically everybody just, if they get inheritance, they donate most of it to Synanon. And he goes, why don't you it was like 25,000. Why don't you donate 20,000 Synanon, take $5,000 and invest it in the stock market and play with it. And at that time, the guy was
waiting a criminal trial for a crime associated with Synanon. And he was being told he was going to have to pay for his own defense.
So it's like, yeah. So, but it is bonkers. That's like, and we see it with every cult we talk about. The people come in and like, you need to give me all your money. And they're like, yep. And here you go. But again, when your people are vulnerable, they're willing to do anything to try to right the ship. Like, just be like steady. Like, But again, all this is talking about is Synanon is getting in tons of money. They're a nonprofit, so they don't have to pay taxes. So they're just growing. They're doing all this different stuff. It's not ag gap. They own gas stations and like apartment buildings. Like they're just growing exponentially really fast, which is never a good sign for a cult, just for the record. Every time that happens, that never works out well.
And then you have all these lifestylers moving in and all this focus on the money, and we stop doing drug treatment and addicts stop showing up. And now we don't have anything to defend our 501c3 status. So what must we do? We must become a religion.
So yeah, as always, the fallback is he creates a religion, and Chuck requires everybody in Synanon to become a member of this religion, be able to push it, be able to promote it. So like everybody has to be in. And again, one of the things someone said was whatever Chuck was trying to do, whatever he was trying to either institute or he was going through, everybody had to go through. So, for instance, he makes everybody do that. The other thing is he goes to a doctor. Doctor tells him, if you don't stop smoking, you're going to have severe emphysema and you're going to get cancer. So not only does he take away free cigarettes, he says everybody must stop smoking.
Stop smoking, yeah.
Yeah, we're getting to this part. Don't worry. The Imperial Marines are. We're getting to that part.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. So yes. But he makes basically, if he's going through something where he has to change, he makes everybody change. Everybody, which is, if you're a cult leader, that's what you do.
To be fair, usually it is I do whatever I want and you do what I say. Whereas his was like, well, if I can't do whatever I want, then you have to do it with me.
Yeah. So we got that. A few things now that we're getting into Synanon, and as we're going later along, they do something called the stew, which I thought was nuts. The stew is the game just 24/7, just all the time. There's never a lull. People are always in the quote stew.
What started, I think it was like, you're going to play the game for 24 hours. And then it was like, you're going to do it for 72 hours. And then it was like, you're going to do it till you can't anymore. Yeah.
Yeah. And so he's doing that. And also we should mention that all these sites, now he had a radio set up where he would broadcast this to everywhere. It was constantly on speakers in every Synanon building.
Again, greatest cult leader, greatest hits.
Yeah.
Well, here's the thing about Stu as well is his intention with that was to create an altered state akin to taking LSD without taking LSD.
Yeah, which is also where he also talked about the trip, which I loved how he named it, the game, the trip, like all these things, and one word. And that's how he described all his different.
It all sounds so fun. I want to play a game. I want to go on a trip. Is it going to be a vacation? No, it's going to be horrible. People are going to scream at you for days.
Yeah. And the trip was supposed to be LSD experience without the drugs, which sounds fucking horrendous.
There's like literal government, well, in Canada anyway, maybe in the US, but those records haven't been released. But in Canada, there were literal experiments that they were doing to get people. Daniel,
hey, you would not
find a way.
I'm telling you, he probably would have done that. No, but anyway,
there's TENS units that make men feel the experience of contractions. You would have made them wear those.
Yeah.
But yeah, there were experiments in Canada where they would lock people in sensory deprivation chambers until they hallucinated all this other stuff. And, it was very inhumane and terrible. It wasn't good. Mm-hmm. The government had to pay Canadian citizens a whole lot of money because they did that. So basically, if you're trying to make people hallucinate without drugs, it's usually not a positive experience. There's usually not a whole lot of ways to make somebody like break with reality where they're going to be like, that was fun.
Yeah. So there was that. Basically, these things were like a 3-day guided experience, and they would make people basically it was sleep deprivation. Like that's what they would do to them. They would not let them sleep, or if you slept very little. It was built around trying to have people have like a deeper understanding of what was going on in their brain. That was the guise of what it was done under. I did something called compression gaming, which is like just shorter the game, but just way more intense and way more mean.
Yeah. So you haven't slept in 3 days. Someone is screaming at you about what a terrible person you are. And that is supposed to help you reach enlightenment, which I don't think so. I don't think that works.
Yeah,
I think
there's
probably a lot of people did have breaks with reality as a result of that treatment. I don't think that it was pleasant. I don't think it helped them become better people.
yeah, but what's interesting is like you see that these people who were in it and they were like, "Oh, this was great. Like really got to learn." And I'm like, that's torture. That's not great. How are you looking at it like this is awesome? I feel so much better about like I did something for a fraternity when I was in college where basically for a weekend over a 72-hour period, I had 4 hours of sleep and I was not well. Like
Yeah.
I was loopy as shit and I was 20. Like you're in a good physical state. I was loopy as shit and I ended up having to drive for an hour and a half to someplace while I was like completely loopy. That was a terrible experience. Like
I
I
was
don't
so
know how to
sleep
explain
deprived
that.
in boot camp that I hallucinated while I was awake. Like I was having dreams while I was awake.
Same. That whole weekend, I was just like I was like, I'm awake, but like these weird things are happening in the periphery. It
We
was
were the
so
first
freaking
we were the first group to go through that had the new camis, the digicams. And so they were
okay.
telling us like how great they were, you're like pump us up about how fantastic these new very expensive uniforms are. And we were hiking and I saw a guy in the bush and I was like, oh shit, I didn't notice him there. Like those camis are really good. And then I got close to the bush and I was like, oh my God, I'm fucking hallucinating. There is nobody there. Like, and that was the most crazy one because I was actively hiking. I was walking and moving while this was happening, but I had other things like that happen too. It's sleep deprivation will absolutely.
Yeah, we've seen countless studies and just how much sleep deprivation can just completely mess with your physical body, your mental state, your emotional state, all of it. So let me go through some things here with Synanon to try to get through the bulk of some of the stuff because we're not very far into the docuseries, but I think I want to get past some of that so we can kind of discuss the meat and the bones of it. So we some of the things that are also interesting in this for me was how they prioritized not hooking up or being sexually free. It was like relationships were important. They were important to Diedrich. He had a partner who he really loved. It was pretty clear that he loved this Betty lady and she loved him. Like they were very clearly in love, and that's great. But he basically was like, everybody should be in relationships. And while it doesn't appear that he was like, you need to marry so and so, it was like until later. He did that later, but he basically was like, you should be married and you shouldn't have sex until you're married. So that was also a sort of almost evangelical religious sort of approach to it. So hold on. Daniel saying I was so sleep deprived I did have a hallucination. What? Do not recommend. No, I don't recommend that either, Daniel.
It's terrible.
It messes you up. You just feel like your reality is completely off the hinge. So like I said, I thought that was interesting that they were kind of trying to require people to be in relationships. We met some people in there in a docuseries who were like, this is great for me. Like I met someone that I was really happy with and we were able to really bond and we were bond through Synanon and we were all trying to connect because we're all trying to stay sober. There's this thing where they just like, it was, they would do mass weddings, but they were like celebration. They would do themed weddings where one was like a ranch cowboy thing and Betty was a person who was organizing all things and the way they portrayed the docuseries like it was a healthy and nice thing. So good for those folks. That works. Great.
It's also of its time as
Yeah.
well, right? Like we're going to defeat your moral failing of addiction. and get you into this moral life, and you're going to get married if you're going to have sex, et cetera, et cetera. Good night, Joker. You've been a great participant this episode. Thank you. Sorry, I'm trying not to sneeze.
Yeah, no, it's okay. So yeah, it is interesting because what was interesting about this too. So these people were supposed to be married and not having sex, but when they did get married, if they wanted to have sex, they had to sign up like it was a conference room to the guest room where they could go and have relations.
It's so
And oh my god, that is so messy. And I will tell you, the thing that popped into my head was fucking Jersey Shore, and they would have something called the Smosh Room, which was
oh
like the room where they would all just go and fuck people randomly. And it
But it
was
made
like,
me think of go ahead.
no, that just made me think of that and just how freaking gross that would be. And there was a person who was in charge of the book to sign up. And then there
Yeah.
was people who would go in, and after somebody was done, they would get it for the night. And then the next day, people would have to go in and clean up the whole thing. And I'm just like, oh, no, nah. Hard pass. I don't care.
Well, so it was I was in a discussion with some fellow ex-Mormons, and they were talking about like this drive to always be at church every Sunday, no matter what else was going on. And someone was talking about like the awkwardness of when the newlywed couple shows up to one of their parents' church services, and everybody's just staring at them like, "Oh yeah, we know."
Yeah, you guys were just doing it, weren't you? Yeah. I did make one note here, and I want to ask you what your thoughts on this. At this point, what the fuck is with the overalls?
They didn't talk about it.
No, did you hear that in
They,
the podcast? Why they went to
they
overalls?
did talk about it in the podcast, but I didn't get to revisit the episode where they talked about it, so I can't fucking remember why.
Like, so Diedrich just starts wearing overalls like he's some sort of hayseed off a fucking hee-haw, and just
Yeah,
and all of a sudden, all the guys, and well, not just guys, later on,
women
all the
too. Yeah.
women too
Well,
were
and I
wearing.
think I can't remember if it followed the shaved head or if it came before the shaved head, but I think it was like all about this really utilitarian way of living that was like not about how you looked or like giving into these concepts of like having nice clothes or looking a certain way. Because the other thing is like there's this idea he made everything seem like it was their idea.
Yeah, so they would buy
And I
in.
don't
Yeah,
think that this shaved head thing was really like
yeah, we didn't even
this
talk about that, but
ad that spread like wildfire. Like it seems hard to believe.
well, the thing is, from the docuseries, they were talking about how this one woman was thought she had an inroad in the game to fuck with Chuck, the leader. And Chuck basically said, if you're a man, I would shave your head, because that was sort of a punishment for men, was
For the
like,
men, yeah.
because this was the 60s and 70s. Everybody had long hair. So if you were having a shaved head, you really fucking stood out. So he would shave the head of men who would disagree with him. And she, being defiant, was like, then fucking do it. And then she did it. And it was like this sort of rallying call for women within the organization, which I'm sure Chuck had no fucking clue that would happen. So all these
Right, but I
women.
do think this is what I'll say about it. I think there had to be some way for it to be an accepted and encouraged behavior for as long as it was. There was some kind of fucking spin that Chuck put on it to make it about what
But he
he was
did.
not going to make it out like, oh, this is in protest of me.
No, because if you recall, there's part of the docuseries where like the women in one location where he was, which was in LA, were like, oh, that location has more women shaving their head. And you could hear a woman going, we need more women. We can't let them beat us. And this was in the
Yeah.
bay, the Tavares or Talaris or whatever bay. So he was like, oh, well, I heard they have more. Like, he just leaned into it. It was a sort of a savvy move because it was a protest against him. And then he was like, well, I'm going to lean right into this, and fucking, they can't take, I'm going to be the one owning this. So basically all the women shaved their head, all of them. And the thing is there was one woman who said, well, I was a teenager and like my hair was my pride. Um,
Right.
um, so she was like, well, then I shaved it. And then my parents were like, you didn't shave your head, did you? And she was like, yeah, I did. And then she's like, well, that's when my parents knew I was in a cult. So yeah, so there's culty things where basically you're making people do things that are sort of anti-establishment. Um, you know, uh, there's also like he's still growing business. He's still doing a bunch of different things. There's a thing where um, basically the lifestylers now at this point, the lifestylers are the people who weren't addicts. So just to be clear on that, and they would come in, and these people were bringing money into the thing. So he's growing the business. He's making it big. Tells people he is a business executive. And now they're not focusing so much on helping people with addiction issues. They haven't for a while, but this is really now where he just leans into the idea of wealth and growing the business. That's a business executive. He says that I like to be rich. All Americans would like to be rich. So he's leaning into something which he never did when he was earlier on. He would, it was all poor. Like we were poor. We were just going, like the early edition of Synanon was we were just flying by the fucking seat of our pants. We're just barely scraping together to keep this thing together. But now they have wealth because they keep getting donations, not just money. They get donations of food, clothing, all kinds of goods and services. Like they're doing all kinds of different things. But now we get to a point where things aren't quite as rosy because negative news starts coming. Because earlier the media was like doing this fucking frenzy of just like Synanon doing this great things with addicts. And now all of a sudden, as usual with news, well, not everything's as rosy as you think. So they started doing different things. The San Francisco Examiner does an article which saying Synanon was the racket of the century. Diedrich gets mad, sends his lawyer, which was, I forget what the guy's name was. Basically a libel case. Sued them for 32 million. But he also at this point decided to start a law school in Synanon so that they have people who know the law, which is just
Oh my God.
yeah, let's just start a law school. Great, awesome. The case that was he sued for 32 million was settled for 600K, $600,000, and he took 300,000 and told like 30 of the other leaders to take 10 grand and do what they want with it. What a generous motherfucker! Like,
Yeah. Well, that's the way to keep people on your side, right? It's like, oh, look at, he's so
I gave you 10 grand. Isn't that
he was
generous?
greedy. If he was greedy and money hungry, he wouldn't have done that.
Yeah. So, but because they're not getting any any more addicts in, they're in danger of losing their tax exempt status. So, like I said, he starts saying, "We're going to do this religion stuff," which that's when Phil Bourdette, who's their lawyer, uh, uh, files with the IRS to be a religion. So now they're back in it. So now they have to do this religious stuff to be able to do uh, religious stuff so they can maintain their tax exempt status, which is just, that we've seen this happen many times before. Like I said, it's the cult stew. They're just
Yeah.
full.
Well, the thing is that they kind of it kind of doesn't work, but he finds another avenue, which is now that he's got this military school thing going on, he can take in foster children who have behavior issues or whatever and put them through the Synanon school.
Yeah, and it's not just foster children; it's kids who are quote unquote delinquents.
That's what I was looking for. Behavior issues.
Delinquents.
Yeah.
Delinquents, which kids can be delinquents for a gazillion reasons. There's a lot of things, and the thing is they didn't know any of that back then. They didn't know, and I'm not excusing them. Just saying they didn't have the knowledge to understand that it could be brain chemistry, it could be upbringing, it could be parents, it could be
I mean,
school, it could
you
be
don't have
people.
that. When you look at the way that kids are put through the system now, it's like we don't have that knowledge. So I can only imagine when it literally didn't exist, right?
Yep. Yeah. So uh, we're gonna. So episode 3 talks a lot about the abuse the kids suffered. This was a hard episode for me. And it's funny because, well, not funny, but Buddy Jones and Ron Mullen were basically the people who ran the school. And they would do some awful shit to the kids. And Buddy Jones was like, well, it was fine back then. That's what everybody did. I don't think it was a bad thing. I don't think I was abusive. And there's one guy, I can't remember who his name was. He was like, well, Buddy and I still talk to Buddy. He was, I always thought he was fair. And I thought that was just, dude, you need a bit more therapy because that's not fair what he did to you. But
I think there's an element of like, I think what that implies to me is that there were other people involved who were indiscriminate with their abuse.
Yeah, like Mullen was asked directly by the interviewer, who was Rory, and I can't remember a last name. He said, "Is there anything that you remember that was very definitively like that was something I really regret?" And he goes, "I am unwilling to answer that question. I'm not going to. I'm uncomfortable doing that." And I was like, "So you did some really heinous shit."
The answer is yes.
The answer is something that really fucking haunts him, and he doesn't voice it publicly because it is really fucked up.
Yeah.
And he even said later, he was like, well, they would do this thing where like everything's normal. Well, this thing happened. Well, that's just a little bit thing. So, and just, well, now there's this little other thing. There's a little other thing, and it's a little other thing. And just like, yeah, and that's how cults work. Like you are pushed to just accept. And he did. And Mullen is a villain in this story to me, but in a different way. Ron Cook is the biggest villain in this. Like Diedrich was just a megalomaniac and a narcissist, and I get that. And people followed him, and they shouldn't have. But Ron Cook still thinks that was all great.
Well, and this is the thing too, right? It's like when we hit the end of Jonestown and they wanted to talk about like, oh, well, he couldn't have been doing that all on his own. It's like, yeah, but the things he asked for, he could have asked for all on his own, as crazy as he was. Whereas with Chuck, I really think like he couldn't have been doing it all on his own.
Oh, I agree. And that's where someone like Ron Cook, who was like, we see it later where Chuck relapses and he's going into a hospital and he's just a mess. And he sees Ron, oh, everything's okay. Ron's here.
Yeah. And
which means Ron was a fixer for him. Ron was a fixer for him.
Yes. And also not only was Chuck in relapse, he was also diagnosed very late in life as being bipolar. And I know it's not called that now, or maybe it is now, and it was called, I don't remember. Never mind.
Probably schizophrenia back then. I don't think they had the bipolar diagnosis.
Sorry, it used to be called manic depression. Now it's called bipolar disorder. Anyway,
they mentioned it as bipolar in the docuseries, but yeah.
Yeah, and they but you don't become bipolar like in your 40s and 50s. So this had to have been going on for a really long time, unless it was substance use induced mania, which is possible, but I don't think that's very common with alcohol.
No. But there is some other things going on that are outliers in this. Like we learn that Betty, his wife, is getting really sick. They go and they find out she has cancer, like a really advanced cancer. It's like not curable. So she gets diagnosed in January. She dies in April, which, you know, like I said, we said earlier, those two were in love. They were very much in love with each other. So it is interesting that like she passes and he almost immediately is like, I'm going to put something on the wire. Any woman who's single and wants to be my wife, submit your application. Submit your application. That is fucked up.
I think there is a lot of he has a lot of strangely religious like tendencies, I guess, for lack of a better word, where it doesn't seem like Synanon was especially traditional in that sense, but like then you have the thing like, well, you got to be married if you want to have sex, stuff like that. And I have found in a lot of like heavily religious communities, the men do not know how to live without a wife. So if their wife dies, they're
That's not just religious, by the way.
well, no, believe me, I know, but like in religious communities, it's almost like nobody even blinks. Like, of course, he got married in 6 months.
Yeah, and it's something like, listen, I know TikTok's going to go away here in a few weeks, but one of the things that I've really enjoyed and learned is just these women who come on TikTok and talk about a variety of things. One of them is the complete myth of the male loneliness epidemic. That's nonsense. It's just guys aren't good to the people, and women are just like no longer willing to tolerate that shit. I'm not willing to be with someone who doesn't meet my needs. That's good. That's an inherently good thing.
Yeah.
And like it's I don't know. I just find that sort of thing super incredibly interesting to get a view that I don't get. Like I am in a super stable, super happy marriage, but like my first marriage was a complete mess. And that wasn't a fault of me or my ex-wife. It's because we were terrible together and we didn't know how to communicate. And we communicated completely different. But like it's uh, I I just think that like people learning how to communicate with each other, that's a net benefit for everybody, including your kids if you have kids. So yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So man, we got there's so many different things to this. So I'm gonna try to move through if I could. Um there's some things with Buddy and Ron Mullen where Diedrich at some point tells them to use whatever fucking physical means they need to get kids in line into Punk Squad. So they build a tent city, which is like a barracks. I've never been in a barracks. You have. So
Well,
please
they're nice
explain that concept.
cities. So actually, I think these were more like what we would call a squad bay. A barracks is usually like, 2 to 4 people to a room with a closed door and, like lockers for your shit, where these are more like I said, squad bays, which is what I experienced like in boot camp and in certain training environments where it's just, rows of bunk beds and everybody's in there and you're all living communally and it sucks really, 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 really bad. And everybody gets sick all the time, by the way.
Yeah, it was interesting because one of the things is like those kids were basically in boot camp. They would get them up at 5, make them run multiple miles. They would get a shower, but then they had to make their beds perfectly. If they did not, then they would have to remake their beds. They would make breakfast. Like it was. That's how I see boot camp. I've never been in boot camp,
So that's
but
boot camp. Yeah.
yeah. One thing Buddy Jones says, I didn't abuse kids. I would never abuse a child. And my comment was, the fuck you didn't. Like you just beat the shit out of kids. You're like, what the fuck? So yeah. Yeah. So Norm Johnson, who is a guy we didn't mention, but was part of Synanon from fairly early on, said that one of his nephews was one of the first ones thrown in the punk squad, and they brutalized him so bad that that when he left, he couldn't fit into society, and eventually intentionally OD'd.
Yeah.
That's fucking horrible.
Yeah.
Yeah, man. All right. So the other thing is like you mentioned earlier with the like, so they had this camp where the kids, and was this in Tavares Bay, Tulares Bay,
Tamales Bay. Yeah.
Tamales Bay. So there was a ranch behind them where Gambonini was the last name. Alvin was the dad. Robert was the son. Alvina, and they would help kids who escaped. They would call those kids' parents, and he would drive them to a bus stop and give them money and say, "Here's money to get home." That guy was a fucking saint. Like he
Yeah.
helped kids who were fucking troubled, who were getting the shit kicked out of them. It was like, here's some money, get home, be safe. But that results in some really bad shit for him. Like this, like Chuck would basically called him an enemy, named his address, named him, said he's an enemy of Synanon. So basically, one night he's driving home with his wife. His daughter's in the front seat sleeping between them because it's 70s or 80s or whatever. So the kid doesn't have to be in a car seat.
Yeah.
And so he sees a car. They pull over. Synanon people fucking assault his car. Smashes. They open the door and they started beating him up, like beating him up. And somehow they escape it. It is a mess. But this opens the door for the cops to come into Synanon.
What I think, again, the podcast goes into more detail on this, and I think his son had something to do with him getting out of it. His teenage son got involved, or he may have been preteen even. But yeah, it was horrible. And even in this, they talk about like they pull him out of the car and start beating him, and then they look up and there's just more and more and more Synanon people like invading their ranch. It's terrifying.
Yeah. Like one of the kids leaves the car because he's terrified, and he just sees more and more Synanon people. Like it's just bad. But this allows the police to go and basically be like, "Hey, what the fuck's going on?"
Yeah, right.
It's good. So remember we talked a bit about how they called everything the game, and then they called it the trip, and then they called something called the shoot. I have a question for you on the shoot, by the way. There's a thing where they're walking with pistols, and goddamn, it's just listen. As a person who grew up around guns, I did because I grew up in rural Pennsylvania, but I grew up around rifles. I did not grow up around pistols. But Diederich says this is how you hold a pistol, and he basically has the chamber open and is holding it like this weird fucking way. Whereas, please tell me, as someone who has worked with guns way more than I have, how ridiculous that is.
Well, so I never like qualified on the pistol in the Marines because you have to be a certain rank, whatever. But I have shot many a pistol. No. But he also, he had a really weird attitude about guns in the first place. Like they're playing footage of them training with guns, and the audio over it is him making basically an anti-gun argument. That whole thing it was so weird. It was just so weird. Like I'm surprised you caught like the way he's holding it is funny because the whole thing was just like, what is happening?
All of it was nuts, but that particular thing was like, as someone who has handled guns, has handled pistols. I'm not a person who has pistols.
It's like the equivalent of saying that this is how you hold it, right? Like
that whole gangster like that's not how you shoot guns. Like even a pistol, you need to be mindful of how you hold it, like where your trigger finger is. You need to make sure like you know exactly how many bullets are. You're shooting a 6-shooter or you shoot whatever your clip has. Like you need to be aware. You need to be very aware of what you're doing. And this guy was like, just open a thing and just carry it like you're. What the fuck is this? Like he's holding it like this with like I didn't understand what he was doing at all. Like it was just completely nuts.
Yeah, well, he wasn't. Yeah, I think it's like the thing, right? Is that he comes across as somebody who feels like he has to be the expert about everything, or people are going to figure out that he's full of shit about everything.
Yeah. So there's that. There's also the idea that now that Betty has passed, he needs to take a mate. A mate. Has to be a mate. So basically, he like Rebecca talks about how her teacher Ginny, which is my sister-in-law's name, by the way, which puts a whole weird spin on it. And basically, Ginny submits her thing, and basically over the wire, he says that's a person. Over the wire, just Ginny, great. So
gotta be clear, like the wire is just like basically a closed radio station, right? Like it's not. Yeah, it's so goofy. Yeah. It's so weird.
Yeah. So he marries her, which spawns him to say all relationships are null and void. You need to find new partners.
Which is so. I mean, they said like, oh, a lot of people left. It's like, what the like? You just told me that I have to be married and marriage is so important. And now I got to find a new partner because, again, because he had to, literally had to, but he didn't, I guess, didn't have to. He could have been single if he wanted to. But yeah, it's so fucking weird. It is so, exactly, Daniel. Just when you think it can't get weirder, it gets a little bit fucking weirder.
Oh, it's going to get weirder too. Just
Yeah.
So basically, all these people who were married, it was funny. One of the guys named Mike, who was like, I swear to you, he reminds me of a Rankin Bass character from like the Year Without a Santa Claus or some shit. I'm sorry. I'm not a person who likes to make fun of appearances. It's not appearances. It's just the way he was. He was sitting on a couch and he was like this. He wasn't facing the camera. He was sitting with his body facing this way and his head was like this. And that's how he talked the entire docuseries, which I thought was really weird, but that's what he did. And, but he was like, he was madly in love with his wife and his wife had to marry someone else. And he was like, oh, well, you can have this person. And by the way, it was suggested to him by the other people in Synanon, you should marry this person. And he's like, I can't do that. So they kick him the fuck out and they drive him to San Francisco and drop him in the middle of San Francisco with no money. Just
no wife.
No wife, nothing. Just fucking good fucking luck. So
and he didn't talk it sounds like he tried. Because he talked about how nice this girl was and how sweet she was and everything else, but he just couldn't do it.
Yeah, he just couldn't do it. He wanted to do it because he was so committed to Synanon, but just like, man. So
how are you that guy's wife and you don't leave with him? Like how fucking he's willing to be exiled for you. Come on.
Well, there's the other one where Phil Ritter and his wife Lynn Ritter were like, he's like, fuck this, I'm getting out. So he divorces Lynn. She gave him custody of their daughter. So this whole story is just completely fucking bonked. This is where the rattlesnake comes in. But so basically, he leaves, but he's still in the San Francisco area. He basically like he wants. So Lynn's like, here, you take our daughter. It's great. And he's like, Lynn can see the kid anytime because it's mother, whatever. So one of the times Lynn takes him and flees and doesn't come. So Chuck says, well, Chuck gives her money, says flee to our Detroit location, which results in Phil deciding to file charges, kidnapping across state lines. And he is told, if you continue with this will be bad for you. And one night he comes home and they beat the ever living shit out of him to the point that he's in a coma for 22 days.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know. Yeah, what's funny is Jack Kent, who his wife had left earlier, when he heard about that was his, like, that's enough. Like, it's just weird where people's points are like, that's enough, I'm out. Like,
yeah, and yeah, I mean, I have weird stories like that about people I know in much less intense situations, and it's like, it's the straw that breaks the camel's back is different for everybody, but I think what it is it seems like a weird thing to us, but it's like the 10 millionth weird thing, right? That's whack.
Thanks, Crisscross. Anyway. Yeah, so that's messed up. But now we're getting to the point where in 1978, Narda Zakino, who's an investigative reporter with the LA Times, this lawyer is getting in contact with a person who has gotten out of Synanon and says, you need to talk to this person. Her name's Frances Wynn. She has a story. She went into Synanon. They wouldn't let her out, told her husband that, and they told her that her husband didn't love her, and they shipped her north. This is where they went to the Tamales Bay. Morantz and the husband were able to somehow get her out 10 days later. They never just figured out. They never explained how that happened.
I feel, well, so I think that story exists, just doesn't exist in this documentary because Phil Morantz, this is not the last time that he goes head to head with a cult. And he actually he passed away a few years ago, or maybe, very recently, actually, like 2 years ago. He was the pro bono lawyer for Cult Podcast, which we refer to a lot, helped them come up with their little like disclaimer, which we don't have one, so don't sue us.
Please.
But he represented them when they were being sued by a different organization that had to like get a gag order and pull an episode and all kinds of crazy shit. So yeah, and
please tell me it wasn't. Please tell me the people that did that weren't the folks that also are followers of a certain guy with the last name Hubbard.
No.
Okay.
I haven't done a Scientology episode yet.
Bless you.
Knowing that they are extremely litigious, I'll tell you after the show. But also apparently was in a legal dispute with the producers of the podcast I've been talking about. That was produced by Robert Downey Jr. and his wife, Susan Downey's production company, because I guess he had given them a bunch of resources on Synanon, because not specifically Robert Downey Jr. I don't know the details like this, but like he had given them, whoever was making this podcast, some resources and given them an interview as they were thinking about doing something. And then they basically took everything and did it and didn't credit him. And so he was actually in a legal dispute with them when he died. Oh. So there's your very weird inside story about Paul Morantz.
Yeah. So point we're also, when I talked about the shoot, the reason the shoot happened was because they were arming people to be a defense force for Synanon, because Diedrich thought that they were under attack.
Right. Well, I got a quote from that was like really chilling. I wrote it down. Oh, my notes won't scroll. Hold on. He said, like, you have to be awake when they come in the middle of the night or something like that. I can't find it because my phone is just not.
But it was something to that effect, like you need to be prepared.
Oh, because sleep in your clothes so you're ready when the attack comes.
Yep. And this is, like I said, this is the stew. This is the like all these cults are like, hey, you have to be ready for everybody's the enemy and that sort of thing. So, so yeah, there's that. Morantz basically becomes like enemy number one. Basically, Ron Cook, again, this is a super villain for me, claims Wynn and her husband said her husband was beating her. So when they took her in, they were protecting her. She wasn't restrained. She could have left at any time. This is a very common refrain for cults. Like you could have left any time, but no, you couldn't have. You absolutely couldn't have.
Well, the story, I mean, we don't get her point of view on it, so it's hard to know. But the story just sort of doesn't sound like it was even brainwashing. It sounds sort of like maybe, I don't know, my most generous fucking take on it is like that she got caught up in something without realizing what was going on. That's like the most generous take I could give for a situation that happens that fast, you know?
Yeah. So Morantz sues Synanon on behalf of Wynn. They win $300,000. This makes Diedrich fucking furious. And he goes on The Wire, which is a public system, and just basically says, I wish someone would do something about that Morantz guy. And publishes his, like, says out loud his name, his address, which results in some guy named Lance. God, I can't remember his last name. Lance and Joseph Musico. I can remember that.
Remember Musico, yeah,
because it's a fucking weird name. Basically, they take it upon themselves to go to Morantz's house. Lance what?
Kenton and
Kenton,
Joe Musico.
that's it. And Kenton's dad was like a very famous musician, a jazz musician of some sort. So, which is what, and Lance Kenton's dad put him in Synanon because he was traveling like 300 60 days a year or some shit. So he's like, here, go to this school.
Well, yeah, and then he's like, yeah, my mom just wasn't around,
Yeah.
which is really sad. Like,
Yeah. So anyway, Lance Kenton and Joseph Musico basically put a rattlesnake in his mailbox, which was a mailbox. So it was like a thing where it was like you could put mail in, but you go inside the house and you could just pull whatever. And
yeah, it was like a slot, but on the back of this, they showed a picture of it. So it's a mail
like
slot
a
on the top of an actual box on the back where you just reach in.
Yeah. So Marantz looked in and said, I thought I saw something. And he reached in. And that's when this rattlesnake bit him. He basically calls the reporter, which I think is fucking hilarious. He doesn't call next to kin. He calls up a reporter and is like, hey, come and get me in the hospital. And the reporter lies, and just like, yeah, I'm his sister. They're like, great, go in. And I'm like, that would never happen today.
My favorite part is she says when she gets in, he's like, I knew you'd do it. I knew you'd get in here.
Like they're Scooby-Doo detectives. Like, yeah, okay, yeah. So luckily Marantz is able, they had antivenom in the hospital, so he survives the rattlesnake attack, which, by the way, as someone who grew up in Northeast America, like I am very familiar with rattlesnakes.
Yeah,
I've
same.
seen them, I've heard them. Who the fuck cuts off the rattles?
Yeah, that was the thing, right? They were like, well, it was evidence that he felt, Paul Marantz felt that was evidence it was an attempted murder, because you want there to be a warning, and if it was just supposed to scare him, then it could have made noise. But also, it's like kind of hard to die from a rattlesnake bite if you're near a hospital.
Yeah, but at the time, but I imagine it was much more common. Common's the wrong word. Much more likely in that time because I'm not sure a whole bunch of hospitals had venom at that time, antivenom. But like, still, that is like some fucking nefarious Egypt type shit to just
yeah, like he's Cleopatra.
Yeah. So
anyway, he lives, which is
he lived, but at this point, we start seeing this is where all of a sudden, like now the police are really involved. And Musico and Lance, whatever the fuck his name is, famous jazz musician, Dad Hanlon, whatever, they get charged. And this is where Diedrich just fucking jets. He's like, great, I'm leaving.
And God, and he's in such terrible shape too. Like they pull him out of when they find him, they have to pull him out on a hospital gurney.
Yeah, so basically he goes to Italy with a bunch of people and they stay there, and that's when the drinking starts. He's like, fuck it, I'm just gonna start drinking. Although that's not true. Everybody said, the people said that he was drinking when he found out Betty was sick.
Betty died, right.
Before Betty was sick, he was like
was in Italy, yeah.
Yeah, but now he's like, everybody, fuck it, let's just drink. So everybody drinks. That was one thing. The police raid the whole Synanon compound when they are like Lance Kenton and Joseph Musico are being investigated. And now when they're raiding it, they find tapes, which of course, because they're tapes, because they fucking tape everything. Diedrich flees to Lake Havasu in Arizona. You're closer to Arizona. Lake Havasu, have you ever been? Because I definitely have not.
What I know of Lake Havasu is it's a party place, but it's also the desert. Like that's all I really know, and I don't know if it was like that back then. So
like Burning Man place.
No, more like spring break for poor, like not poor, but like Marines go there to party and shit like that.
Yeah, so at Lake Havasu, this is
right. There you go.
Yeah, but Lake Havasu, this is where the police track Diedrich down and they arrest him. Like you said, they arrest him on a gurney. He was arrested on a gurney because he was so drunk he couldn't walk.
Yeah. At that point, this is wild to me because at that point I thought with the way they were describing him, I was like, that sounds like late stage alcoholism, like he's about to die from alcoholism. But then the documentary just keeps fucking going. Like he just, I don't even know like how it's like he was attempting to drink himself to death and couldn't quite accomplish it.
Yeah, like he was trying and he just couldn't get it. So he gets arrested, but the thing is like so Lance and Joe Musico basically are they're the headliners. So the organization decides we're going to make them the fall guys. So again, this is where we talk about Ron Cook, the fucking super evil villain, because fuck that guy. I hope he gets punched in the face a million times when he dies.
He's
It's
still
interesting
alive.
because Lance says this is something I wrote down. Lance says his dad died while he was under indictment and left him 25K. Ron Cook tells him to donate 20K and keeps 5K. Lance responds, "Are you out of your mind?" He never talks to Cook again. And yet Lance said he didn't think Diedrich was devious enough to suggest him himself. He thought it was Cook.
Here's
Absolutely fucking Diedrich would have suggested that.
yes. I think I think that goes back to what I was saying, where it's like he probably wasn't calling the shots, but everyone was behaving as though he was. It's like, what would Chuck do? Oh, Chuck would let these guys take the fall.
Yep. So basically, at this point, Lance and the other guy, Musico, decide that they're going to take a plea. The plea is basically for time served. They're trying to get rid of it. The judge meets with the DA, and the judge sentenced them to 3 years probation, first year in county jail. Diedrich was sentenced to 5 years probation for his role in it. Lance said in hindsight, he said, "I wouldn't let everyone up. I would just throw everyone under the bus." Like, good for him, but that's too late. You've already done that.
Well, and that's the thing is like it sort of makes it sound like, oh, like Chuck, blah, blah, but like something went wrong when they made that deal because you're supposed to agree to the terms of a deal that's on the table, not.
Yes, but as someone who has been in the legal system a few times, I will say you can agree to a plea. The judge does not have to adhere to it. That is not a requirement. The judge could go, "I hear your plea. I don't think that's severe enough or light enough." He can go either way.
Huh.
So the judge, they can say, well, "We pleaded this." The judge would be like, "I don't think that's stout enough, or I think that's overly aggressive." The judge can make it the sentence whatever the fuck they want, as long as it's within the guidelines of sentencing guidelines for the crime.
Well, but that's what I mean. Is like that didn't have anything to do with Chuck. That had to do with the legal system.
Yep.
Him getting screwed over on the plea.
Yep. So so what's so interesting. So Chuck gets this 5-year probation period, which in part of that probation means he cannot be in charge of anything with Synanon. He cannot. Except he just makes his daughter the head of Synanon, JD, and it's like she said, "I wasn't in charge. My dad was, but I was just in charge of name only." So I was the chairman, but my dad was in control. So what's interesting is now the game still continues. The game, and this guy named Navarro, and I forget his first name, just basically said the game became sort of like this thing as like a laboratory to fuck with people, which is what Chuck did. He's like, "All right, well, fuck it. We're here now. I'm drunk. I'm going to do all the things." But now, because Chuck was openly drinking, Bill Godson, who had left at 19, just said, "Fuck this," and left. He came back for a high school reunion and said it was weird to see an open bar.
Yeah, well, duh, right? Because the whole fucking thing is that we don't do that. But because we always do what Chuck does, Chuck is an alcoholic now. Now we all drink, which probably means that a lot of those people were doing more than drinking. Because that's
sure.
that's how it works for some people.
Yeah.
A lot of people.
So this is where things are really fucking unraveling, like really unraveling. This is where we talked about how JD told Rebecca to just go live her life, get the fuck out. Judy as well said, "Get out, live your life." Now they are at a point where AdGap, that thing we mentioned earlier, that's still making millions of dollars for them. That's just been growing and growing. But at this point, they decide to get rid of schools. But basically, that the kids were allowed to go to public school, which the kids were fucking super stoked. The problem is they go to school and they're still in coveralls and fucking white shirts.
Shaved heads.
Shaved heads. women too. And so, but despite this, these kids were academically doing well. They were in sports. They were doing all kinds of activities. But the kids were now like, great, now we can go and drink and smoke. We're out here to hang out with kids in this time frame where everybody drinks and smokes. So they were doing that. And basically, they come back one day to the compound and everybody's like, we know what you're doing. And basically, they shave all of their heads again. And basically does a trip again for them. They were not allowed to sleep for like 3 to 4 days. They were allowed to get up, have breakfast, run a few miles, and then they were allowed to get up, run a few miles, and then they had a sound. They were not allowed to talk. And they put those kids in basically ag gap to pack boxes so those kids couldn't fucking finish high school.
I sort of feel like that was like, oh, you're drinking. I feel like that was an excuse. I think that they like figured that they could make more money with having the kids pack the shit, and then they made up a reason to bring them back. That's my opinion.
I agree. All right, so things are fucking spiraling heavy at this point. So one point, a member hears Diedrich by the pool talking to his dead brother. Navarro recalls the night around midnight where they're summoned to a meeting. Diedrich gets on the wire. He wasn't there. Basically starts ranting about how something was moved. His glasses were moved. And he said, well, that means I've been violated. I can say that I've been raped.
Yes.
And now he tries to make women step forward who say they've been raped, which is completely fucked up. You can't compel someone.
Detail about it. Yeah, that was fucking wild. And this is the thing is like, we're in the last episode right now. This is all just hitting like one thing after another because it all happened like.
Yeah. So basically he's going off and he's ranting and his son decides to cut the wires so that it doesn't continue to broadcast. He realizes his dad has just fucking lost it. Rebecca, who we talked about earlier, like she manages to get Louis Yablonsky is the guy who manages to get her into that. But at this point, Synanon has lost her tax exempt status, and the IRS says you need to pay us $55 million, which in the 80s or 90s was $55 million is a lot now. Back then, that was 5 times as much as what you would pay now. So it was funny. They had to sell out real estate, and the fucking Ron Cook guy is like, "This is depressing. Fuck you, you fucking knob. Fuck you.
Your whole fucking life is depressing." Like, yeah.
What was interesting? So this Navarro guy is like trying to talk about the whole thing, and he just could not get himself to say that they were in a cult. He just could not get himself to be like, we were in a cult. No, he just wouldn't do it. And I just felt that was kind of sad. We get to the point where a lot of Synanon folks moved to Visalia, which is below where they were doing. And
this part was so fucking weird to me because I grew up in the county. Like, my mom lives in Tulare County right now, I think.
Yeah, so they moved there. Diedrich and Jenny, his new wife, moved to a trailer park, and he eventually goes to a small care facility. He passes away in the 90s. There's one thing that Ron Cook said, which was like, the bonds created in community are strong. And my comment was, yeah, so is trauma. That's the end of my notes, which was 10 pages of notes, folks. That was a yeoman's effort.
He did it in record time. But we can go on and on. I feel like we could have done like, I know we talked, if I had a voice, we could have talked so much about like some of these intricate details because this one's kind of wild. Like I think that, again, when I said it up top, like they set things back more than they pushed them forward because it ended up the way that it did. Because the idea of addicts helping addicts, people being able to live in a treatment center, people being able to have peer support, have family in there with them, all of those things are things that just like kind of recently we've been like, oh yeah, actually, like if we let people stay as long as they needed to, they might not fuck up when they get out. If
Yep.
we let parents, see their kids, like there's so much good right there in the beginning. And then it's just this, like I said, I don't think Chuck was ever in recovery. I think he just wasn't drinking, and there's a difference. I think that he very much went from being an alcoholic to like, oh, 12-step worked, but I need more than 12-step. And then he creates the game. It's like, well, I need more than that. And then he creates Synanon. And well, I need more than that. And it just went until he's right back where he started, which is, this like heavy drinking that is like almost impossible to imagine. Like really just the amount that they're talking about is like mind blowing.
And yeah, so this Daniel mentioned this had a lot of layers. It was a lot more than we could get to in this amount of time. Like it is, there's some ones that you just go, I wish we had more time. But like, that's how it is. I'm kind of glad we went through this because there's a few, when you look at some of the cults we've covered, some of them have some really good starts. Just like, man, that makes sense. Like, oh, great, this works. This is one of them. But like, it just didn't end well.
My bugaboo on this one, my thing that, again, is just my opinion, and I'm not an expert, and I feel like it's a really good example of why people who are in recovery through peer support things like Al-Anon, or not Al-Anon, AA, NA, all the 12-step programs, they're all 100% peer support. You don't have a therapist there, you don't have a counselor there. I think those people need to, once they get their sobriety under control, they need therapy. And we should make it easy for people to get therapy, which is also, I guess, a controversial opinion in the United States. But like, it's really a different animal. Staying sober is different from being like healthy.
For sure.
And I think that, and I think a lot of the people in Synanon stayed because they didn't know how to be healthy. They didn't know like how to have healthy interactions, healthy relationships, healthy communities. That's the tragedy.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, there was something I wanted to ask, and my brain is completely Swiss cheese at this point. So I think this was an interesting one. I want to talk about a little bit like what we're going to talk about next month. What we have here is something called Brielle, the Alien Project. I have never heard of this guy. I am looking forward to this because this is going to seem like it's going to be kind of a goofy one, and I like those.
There's those promises of like cloning and shit. It's going to be great.
Yeah. So, so
I love alien shit. Like, I'm sure you guys noticed like when we did Unarius. This one sounds like it's going to be a little darker than Unarius though. But I love the alien shit. I've got like 2 books right now I'm reading about alien conspiracy theories. I like to believe the conspiracy theory while I'm enjoying the media, and then I close the book or I turn off the TV and I go about being like a rational human being. No offense if that feels insulting to you. I'm sorry. Maybe you know something I don't. So I think it's going to be a lot of fun, but I'm also prepared for it to be horrible because that is how it goes with this live stream. So
for sure. So anyway, thanks everybody for joining us and, listen to us ramble about this stuff. We always have a great time doing this. So thank you, Renee, as always.
Thank you, Doug.
Yeah, thank you. So,
oh yeah, do reach out.
Please do, because we're always open to new things. So, but again, we really appreciate everything, and we will talk to you folks in a month. Well, February 5th. So, that's the February 5th. So, we'll be here again. Sorry, I was like, well, what are we doing? So, anyway, everybody take care of yourselves. We love you guys. Thanks for joining us.